Good evening. Welcome to our webinar using Zoom. I'm Graham Hunt, the co-convener of the Renew Sydney Central Branch. Usually we have physical meetings which we have been videoing and posting online, but this is our first attempt at a webinar, and so I hope you can be patient with us as we work our way through it. Welcome to all of you, even if you are signing in locally from the Sydney region, elsewhere in Australia, or perhaps even from overseas. It's very exciting to be engaged with so many people. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land upon where I'm sitting and where the Sydney Central Branch operates, and that's the Cadigal clan of the Eora Nation. We acknowledge their leaders, past, present and emerging, and we also acknowledge their sustainable stewardship of the country over many millennia. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional leaders of other parts of the country or in other lands, wherever you may be joining us from. Tonight, we have the pleasure of welcoming Tom Hunt, who will speak to us on the Drawdown project, Technologies to Reverse Climate Change. If you have technical issues during the evening, please use the chat function to get assistance. You can ask questions using the Q&A button. We will go through the questions at the end of Tom's presentation. It is normal that we'll get more questions than we may be able to answer, so please be patient. We will be recording the presentation and that should be available on YouTube in the coming days. I got to know Tom back in 2016 when he was working hard to establish the Renew branch in Illawarra, and I went to one of their first meetings. Tom recently retired as a strategic projects manager at University of Wollongong in the transport area. His overall concern and major motivation now is climate change. He's been a key player in the Wollongong Climate Action Network and is now National Media Coordinator in Citizens Climate Lobby Australia. And I invite you all to welcome Tom to speak to us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Graham. Yes, there I am. Hello everyone. This is new for you, a Zoom meeting for Sydney branch. I understand that it's new for me having presenting to an empty screen. I have presented to a few Zoom audiences now, but never to one where I can't see any in the audience. So look, bear with me. I'll try to keep my enthusiasm through the whole talk. Right. So in introducing myself, I live on the shore of Lake Illawarra, which I've put behind me here. And my reason for getting involved in climate change action was that I started to worry about sea level rise. This is a tidal lake. I've since learned that there's far more important issues to worry about that won't impact me in my lifetime, the sea level rise, but there are a lot more things that worry me beyond that. So I got involved several years ago in doing what I can. I'll now share my screen with you so that I can start the presentation. Play button's hidden by the other operations there. There you go. I hope you can all see that okay. Yes, so the topic of my talk tonight is Drawdown. I got involved with Drawdown a few years ago, well, when it was first announced. The book by Paul Hawken. He was the inspiration for and the editor of the overall project and book. I managed to meet with Paul Hawken when he visited Australia a couple of years back now, and had a good chat with him. I'm very impressed with what he's been doing, and got to the point where I did this wonderful presentation at time to help share the news to others. Little did I know when I offered to do this presentation was they would update Drawdown at the beginning of this year. So I've been rushing around madly to update my slides So excuse me if there are any breaks in here, but hopefully it'll all work. So I'm intending to cover the drivers of climate change, why we need Drawdown, and then of course the Drawdown project, and I'll highlight the project, the presentation on the top 21 solutions. I can't go through them all, and I have to admit I'm no expert on all these technologies, but I've learned what I can from the book, and I would recommend if anybody's interested in these things, they can see an awful lot online, as well as they may want to get a copy of the book. Putting things in perspective to start us off, carbon in our sky, we all know that that's the problem. Putting it in perspective, a person exhales around 360 kilograms. You and I fill 2 or 3 houses full of carbon dioxide, pure carbon dioxide, if we were to collect it. So it's quite a bit we're exhaling, but of course Mother Nature has got that sorted. What it hasn't got sorted is the fact that we have cars and other things that also exhale carbon dioxide, and you can see it's like 12 times as much that a car would exhale as a person. And similarly, when you look at the overall picture around the world, society's mechanisms emit around 36 billion tonnes. That's 36 gigatons in terms of what you'll be looking at tonight in the Drawdown project, and measure things in gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent saved. But what does that look like? 36 gigatons, what does that look like? I thought I'd put that into something that we can all relate to. The size of this pyramid, how many of those do you think we might, if they were made of coal? This one here was the biggest one in Egypt. If this one were made of coal, how many of those would we add to the sky, or have we added to the sky? And I can't hear your answers, but I'll give you the answer. It's 10 per day. That's how many we're currently adding to the sky. And so, yeah, that leads me to think that this carbon capture and storage is perfect, because that's just the carbon part of it. Or, you know, coal is 80–90% carbon. You've got to add twice or more than twice that weight in oxygen, and then you've got to store it away somewhere. Really? Yeah, sure. Okay, it's not going to happen. But look, that's not all we're adding to the sky. The carbon dioxide is increasing. It's gone up to, it's over 410 parts per million now. This is only going up to 2015, this graph. But we're also adding methane, nitrous oxide, and synthetic gases, the hydrofluorocarbons, the refrigerants. They're all adding to the problem, and the total problem is now around 500 parts per million carbon equivalent in terms of warming. That's like 500 compared to 280 parts per million, which is what our Earth, well, humans have been around, it's used to. So that's a problem. Too much anthropogenic carbon affecting sea and air, because of course half of what we're putting up there is soaked up by the sea. And it's long been known that you know, the correlation between temperature and CO2 in the atmosphere, this is going back over the last 800,000 years from ice samples. We can see there's a pretty good correlation, and in fact, if you do a correlation graph, you see that as CO2 goes up, so does temperature. This is taken at one particular point on the Earth's surface, so it's not an average of the Earth's temperature. And it actually shows a much more marked temperature increase. The issue is we're up here now. We're over 400 parts per million. And on this scale, we'd be up 15 degrees centigrade above what we used to. But I'm told by the experts it's not really quite that bad, but look, even the IPCC reckon we've got it dialed up pretty high. We've set the thermostat at, we're now over 400 parts per million. The thermostat is normally set around here for our society for the last 2,000 years. That's where it's been. CO2 has been in this range for the last 800,000 years at least. That's what we've got measured through ice cores. But it's never been up here before, not during human habitation of this planet. And that's what concerns me most. I'm guessing a bit at these figures, but if it's a linear scale, like it's not unreasonable to expect it to be linear based on those previous figures. We're talking about 4 degrees is dialed up, and quite a bit of sea level rise, but it'll take a while. It's lucky this oven that we have is a very slow cooker, a very slow oven. But what will that do to our planet? We know that climate change has happened in the past. As recent as 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, this part of the world has changed from being an oasis to being a desert. The Sahara wasn't always a desert. Certainly, since the last ice age finished, there was a lot of habitation there. It's been proven, and it's gone. That's the sort of climate change that can happen. Other things that have changed is that Europe, which during the last ice age was basically an ice desert, from what I understand, it's obviously lost its ice and become a lot greener. Gulf Stream and other things that happen in the sea and the atmospheric patterns all impact these things. The thing that worries me is what happens if at the moment we've got 2/3 of the world's population in this area here, and they all rely on the monsoons from the Indian Ocean. It's an immense amount of water that gets dropped over this area. And if that were to change in any way, where would those billions of people want to go if they didn't have any food? It's a real worry to me. So how do we solve this? We know some ways to avoid adding more carbon to the sky. We're pretty familiar with those. But how do we draw the rest of it back down? Will nature fix the problem? If we just stop, what happens then? And so I looked at the Carboniferous period, which is when most of the coal on this planet was made. That's this period here on this graph. These are estimates by different scientists. There's 4 or 5 of them in here. You can see that best estimate that over this period of time, parts per million of CO2 dropped down considerably. Something in the order of, I forget the figures there, but anyway, it averaged 1 part per million reduction each 30,000 years. That's when the coal was being produced. Over 90 million years, 3,000 parts per million dropped. So it can happen. Nature does a wonderful thing, but it takes a while. Goes up and down a bit, but the overall average there. But surely it can do it quicker, and it's proven to be able to do it quicker than that. Mother Nature, in between ice ages, around 400 to 350,000 years ago, which humans were around, or starting to be around then. And so it's dropped considerably in that time. How long is that? Well, that's 40,000 years, and it dropped around 100 parts per million in that time. That's still not very quick. And look, if you take the best option that we can find in this graph, a drop of around 20 parts per million over, it's a very approximate figure, but 670 years. That's 20 parts per million in 670 years. 1 part per million in 33 years, in other words. But we're currently adding it at 2.5 parts per million. It's getting close to 3 parts per million per year. We're currently adding. How is that going to work? Mother Nature isn't going to be able to undo what we've been doing. We're going to have to find ways to help it. So what can we do? We can take our foot off the accelerator, move to 100% renewable energy, reduce other greenhouse gas emissions. And we can draw down carbon. We can help Mother Nature sequester it. We could try sequestering it ourselves. There are some ideas about sequestering carbon dioxide. I'm not sure in that form it's so easy to do. But or we could resort to geoengineering so that we cool the planet in other ways. That's what we could do. I don't like those latter ones because I think they're going to be difficult, certainly geoengineering. Well, is it possible to do it just by stopping putting it in there and helping Mother Nature sequester it? That's the big question, isn't it? And to date, there has been no plan, really, or up until a couple of years ago, there's been no serious plan. And certainly our governments, where they're doing bits and pieces, they don't seem to have an overall plan for the world. And so Paul Hawken realized that the scientists of this world all know about their own small areas, but very few of them had put together the whole picture of all the technologies that would be necessary and how much of each one. And so over the last 6-7 years, he's helped put together a project, a plan, and this book, which was published 3 years ago, became a New York Times bestseller, was certainly a very prominently placed book. It had that very bold claim, the most comprehensive plan for solving climate change. Is it really? Well, there aren't any other plans, so it's very difficult to argue with that one. Well, there's nowhere near as comprehensive a plan, I guess. So he involved many scientists and researchers, took him 4 years to compile it. Started with, well, they looked into 80 proven solutions and 20 promising new solutions to come up with a book of 100 solutions, and that's how it was developed, delivered. They considered the resources, the infrastructure, and the costs involved. They did what I believe are fairly conservative estimates based on what they understood, what the science was showing, what reality, what realistic expectations might seem to be there. In fact, almost overly conservative in some aspects. As an example here, for instance, we take electric cars, which you guys probably know more than anyone about. Electric cars, they assume that by 2050, I think it's 15 to 23% of the car fleet by 2050 would be electric vehicles. Now, I'm a bit more optimistic than that. I think we could probably achieve an awful lot more than that, but that's the thinking that went behind these estimates, that sort of level of commitment. With food, as you'll see, they were expecting people only to reduce their meat intake by, reducing the worst case, I think it was 90 grams per day of animal protein, down to about 45 or 50 grams. That's worst case country, probably the USA and Australia would be in there. 90 grams of meat down to 45 grams of meat per day on average. So those sorts of expectations are what they put in there. Halting emissions is achievable. All of the technologies are shown to be there. Halting global warming is a step beyond, but they are very boldly saying, and they've said this in the new Drawdown review that came out just a month or so back, that we can avoid catastrophic warming of the climate with the climate solutions with the solutions that are in hand today. That's a pretty bold statement. To be honest, I'm not confident, but that's what they say, and it's something I hang my hat on. If it's possible, I'd certainly like to see it happen. I would be very keen for that to be the case. as I say, I went through this new revised plan only over the last week or so, to be honest. It was this very presentation that inspired me to get stuck in, because I'd looked at the original drawdown in fair depth. And things have changed quite a bit more than I expected. To be honest, it was quite a headache to me, because I had to go through and change all the slides and add some new ones in here. This is presented in the new plan, and it identifies that the moment of drawdown is when we halt further emissions and start to reduce emissions. It's possible within the time frame of about 2045, 2050, scenario 2, or if we aren't quite as ambitious, scenario 1 would have us do it by about 2065, the point of drawdown. To my mind, we have to go a lot further to take our emissions back down and go negative. The interesting thing is that this is according to what is presented, is doable, and I didn't think it was, to be honest. It would be great to think it is, and yes, the figures seem to show that it is possible. So it does give me a sense of being a little bit more in control. To be honest, of recent months, I've been thinking that it hadn't been a possibility to do this. But let's face it, if the experts say it can be, let's hope that it can. So going into the very specific technologies, I won't be able to go through all of them tonight. The ones I'm going to show you are the top 21, but before I get into those, I'll just take you through some of those technologies or solutions that are identified along the way, and just the broad groupings of them. So land usage. There are a whole pile of things we can do to change our land usage. To stop clearing forests is obviously one very important one, but also to protect our wetlands and other wild areas. Composting. And you'll see with each one of these, I've put in the figures for scenario 2, that is achieving drawdown by around 2045, 2050. This is the sort of gigatons that we should be able to reduce our emissions by, or draw down. To put things in perspective, again, 36 gigatons is how much we add to the atmosphere each year. So that gives you some scale to think of these things. And these figures are for the next 30 years. That's the total over 30 years, 8.7 gigatons. So forest protection, coastal wetlands, these all help directly, but also indirectly if we just look after these spaces by protecting those ecosystems. We will stop as a much greater figure going into the atmosphere in the future. Building cities, that's another of the, just buildings overall. It's interesting to note that this concrete ceiling was built 2,000 years or so back, and it's still standing. It's concrete, and it's not the sort of concrete we currently use. It's actually a much more renewable concrete, using the smarts that we thought we had. We can't do it that same way without producing a whole pile of carbon dioxide, but it is possible. This is evidence that it will last. And there are other technologies. You can see the numbers here, the hash numbers, the actual ranking in the tops, in the how effective each of these will be in the scheme of things, again for solution or strategy 2, option 2, scenario 2. And so this is very much down the list. 26 is getting much higher up the list if we can go to alternative cements. Managing waste is another overall area. I haven't put the top 21 in these initial ones because I'll be covering those shortly, of course. But recycled paper, water distribution, recycling of other things, in this case, materials. If we can just make better use of the materials we've got instead of just putting them in landfill. Carpooling, walkable cities, bike infrastructure, and of course you guys are well into transport, so electric vehicles, hauling trucks, high-speed rail, telepresence. I was a bit disappointed that electric vehicles are only number 27 down the list. Isn't that a shame? I'd like to think that they were much higher, and given my interest in those, at least some things in our striving for reducing our emissions, there are some things in life that are making it more interesting rather and healthier along the way. And something we're all doing a lot of these days is telepresence. You are doing that right now. We're not physically together, working from home. COVID's perhaps helping us along this path. Alternative energy, and there are quite a few different varieties of that, not just the solar panels and the wind farms. Interesting to note that landfill methane is actually a positive instead of a negative. And I questioned this. It had changed from the original Drawdown to the new revised version. It's the only one on the list. It's number 76 now because it's a positive and not a negative. But it is still a necessary. Unfortunately, the reason it goes positive is because other things with our waste management take away the capabilities that it has to reduce emissions. It seems a strange story, but for instance, with food waste minimization, we have less food going into landfill, and so you're not getting as much methane out of it. So the overall effect is for some reason positive instead of negative. But it is necessary to do that in line with the other technologies. And last but not least, energy of scale that I've put in here. And whereas I thought these might have ranked a little bit higher, number 36, number 33, ocean power, number 68. They're not as effective as some of the other options we have. So you'll see them as we go through. Well, number 21. I'll start with number 21, and then I'll work down from there to number 1. The production of bamboo doesn't seem like a very strategic way to reduce our emissions, but it's amazing. Bamboo is an amazing substance. It's stronger than steel in tensile strength per unit weight, and it's stronger than concrete in compressive strength per unit weight. And it's an amazingly fast-growing material. I was quite astounded. I saw this in Hong Kong several years ago. I couldn't believe that building small skyscrapers using bamboo as the scaffold, not steel scaffolding, but bamboo scaffolding all the way up. It's an amazingly strong substance. And it's interesting that it grows to full height within a year, and it develops the strength that you need if you're using it for structural purposes within 4 or 5 years. And when you cut it, it grows back from the same root. You don't have to replant. So it's sequestering carbon in the ground at the same time. And because it's so fast growing, it's far better as a crop than normal other timbers. Regenerative annual cropping. There are new ways of doing farming, not necessarily at the huge scales that we used to, but certainly the agricultural practices that are often ages old in their style prove that we can manage our land better. We can put more carbon back into it by using these sorts of approaches, not tilling the soil, diverse cover crops, so you vary the crops. In-farm fertility, so not adding extra nutrients, but just reusing the nutrients from within the ground you've got, reusing the bio fertilizer that you naturally get from the waste greenery. Not using pesticides or synthetic fertilizers, and multiple crop rotations. These all work to improving the land and improving the yield from the land, and reduce our emissions because of that. Public transit, I guess it goes without saying that if we move people more efficiently and don't have individual cars, one person per car or 1.2 people per car, as we seem to average, then we are going to be much better off. Interestingly, I've looked into this from the transport point of view, and having one person in a car is equivalent to having 6 people in a bus in terms of the amount of energy you're using to get people around. So you've got to have full buses too, or if you can get your car full, you're actually not doing too badly. So carpooling is an important aspect of improving our efficiency. When you think about it, 4 people in the car is 4 times the effectiveness of the energy you're using. Concentrated solar power. Now, this is where you're beaming the sun into a central heat reservoir and using that heat, either storing it in a salt solution or using it more directly. The effectiveness of this is not quite as good as it would appear. You'd expect it would be a far more cost-effective way of storing it and holding energy than perhaps wind or solar, because you're concentrating the energy, storing it away in heat. But not perfect, and it's a major infrastructure, major piece of infrastructure to put in place. Unfortunately, we haven't got the one that was going to go in South Australia happening, but it's certainly an option for the future. Tree intercropping. This is an interesting one. Growing various crops interspersed with each other rather than as monocultures. Apparently, it's basically growing smaller crops in amongst trees for the most part to protect those crops. It adds to the overall biomass, it improves soil organic matter, and it improves carbon sequestration. I haven't looked at it in great depth, but there are many different varieties of tree intercropping. Managed grazing. This is basically keeping the grazing to small areas and transferring the herd, the grazers from one area to another on a frequent basis, but then leaving the area vacant for weeks or even months between grazing. Improves the soil, allows the grass to be more effective feedstock, and overall sequesters much more carbon, improves the soil and sequesters carbon. Temperate forest reforestation. I need to move through these a little quicker. There's a whole pile of areas that have been cleared of temperate forests that could well be regrown. The tropical staple trees there's a lot of trees which bear fruit and nuts and high protein foods that are far higher yield than the equivalent of monoculture agriculture. And of course, not having to replace the crop every year makes a big difference. Tree plantations, and this revised version specifically says on degraded land, making good use of the land that we are currently not well using, and developing forests. Peatlands. I was quite surprised that peatlands cover a much bigger area of the world than I expected. We don't seem to have any in Australia, but they're still only 3% of the Earth's land area. Some specific countries like Ireland, for instance, which we visited several years ago, have an enormous amount of this, but most of it has been destroyed, taken away, burned, which is a terrible shame, a bit like coal and oil going the same way. We need to protect these areas. We're letting an awful lot of carbon into the sky, even from those areas that we're not harvesting. Silvopasture is a really interesting one. Who'd have thought it was more productive to have animals grazing underneath trees rather than open grasslands? And yet overall the land is more effectively used and has improved yields when grazing takes place in that manner. Alternative refrigerants, number 10. The refrigerants were at the top of the list for those who read Drawdown before. In the first book, managing refrigerants came number 1. It's knocked down the list a little bit because they've separated. Using alternative refrigerants, which is obviously going to help. Refrigerants have a much stronger greenhouse gas potential than carbon dioxide, thousands of times stronger. And the refrigerant, the management of those refrigerants that are in current refrigerators and air conditioners around the world, and anybody who's visited Asia realizes just how many air conditioners and fridges there are out there that were probably being scrapped every day, and the refrigerants are not well managed from so many of those places. Even in Australia, I've seen council areas in Australia where they just do not manage the refrigerants going in equipment going to the tip. We really have to store those, take them out of the machines. Split system air conditioners are a real problem because so many people would decommission them by just cutting them out. Next one down the list, number 8, distributed photovoltaics. You'd think that doing it in mass, in large scale, would be a much more effective way, but having distributed solar panels just where you need the power makes a big difference. And of course, we all are pretty familiar with putting them on our rooftops, but it's making a big difference to third world countries too. The developing nations are finding these incredibly useful, able to provide power where no power currently exists. Clean cook stoves is a really interesting one, and it comes very high on the list. Would you believe it's something like 47% of developing nations' cooking is done using wood stoves or charcoal, and of course there's the pollution in the process for those using these technologies, as well as the issue of polluting the air. It's not good for their health. Tropical forest restoration, well, that goes without saying. I think most people are aware of the amount of forest that we're continuing to reduce across the world. Brazil and Indonesia, Malaysia, and Australia are all reducing, well, not so much in Australia, tropical forests, but forests in general. And, well, we just need to do something about them. Health and education. Now, this is an interesting one that's changed again from Drawdown 1. It was called Educating Girls, which I think might have been a little bit politically incorrect, and family planning. And of course, they're still effectively what the author is getting at. It's amazing the difference that will make. And of course, the real story, of course, is our human population. We have far too many new babies being born to this planet that really aren't necessarily wanted or needed. And we really have to consider our population. Plant-rich diet. An interesting thought here is that, hey, we can reduce our emissions enormously just by reducing the amount of meat we eat, because meat uses up so much more of the of our agricultural land to produce than does vegetable matter. And so the less meat we eat, the less emissions we have. Something in the order of, we could reduce our overall agricultural needs by about 2/3 just by reducing our meat to the level at which we need, somewhere around 45 grams per day of meat per person on average around the world, would bring our overall needs down by a third of agricultural land. Reducing food waste, another interesting one. At the moment, about a third of all the food that we grow in the world is not eaten. Around a third. It's mostly in the more developed nations where food is, I guess, a lot cheaper compared to other goods. But it's an enormous amount of food to be wasted. And if we just manage that better, that also would reduce our need for farmland. Utility scale photovoltaics, or otherwise solar farms. Now this is number 2 now. It is a very important aspect, and we worry about it not being as efficient as you might think. To talk of 20–25% efficiency in soaking up energy from the sun. Well, that's pretty damn good when you look at it in comparison to growing crops. It's something like 15 times better than growing biomass to burn. If you tried to produce oil from wheat or petrol from some land crop, you can do 15 times better putting solar panels on that land than try to grow something. And it's a very effective free energy source. And the very top one on the list is onshore turbines. It's the one I thought should have been there in the first instance, but yep, there were others ahead of it in the Drawdown 1. Wind power is an enormously effective way of collecting energy. And yeah, at the moment we've got, well, more than 6%. In 2018, 6% of global electricity demand was covered by wind power. And it's growing at 9% per year. There's the potential for us to get a lot further. So, how much does Drawdown achieve overall if you add up all the gigatons and all of those different solutions? Having done that, and you can see the relative size in the different areas here. Having done that, it adds up to 1,576 gigatons is what it comes to in the sum I've done. Comparing that with what we will produce if we just keep burning fossil fuels and adding carbon to the sky in other ways. 1,080 gigatons. That shows that, yes, well, it is doable. If we can, in 30 years, draw down or stop putting in 1,576 gigatons, clearly we have turned the table round. I'd like to think this is all possible. So it's some optimistic view. We can reach drawdown by mid-century if we scale the climate solutions already in hand. These are 10 key insights that I'll go through briefly with you. I'm going to have to move very quickly through these. Solutions are interconnected. We need all of them. We can't just put one or two. We can't cherry pick from the list. We will end up with a better, more equitable world. And COVID has shown just how much clearer the sky can be if we just stop some of the transport that's going on. The savings are far better than the costs, and the costs are significant, let's face it, but the savings significantly outweigh those costs. We have to move an awful lot quicker than we currently are. Emissions towards zero and supporting carbon sinks. We cannot reach drawdown without doing all that we need. Some of the most powerful climate solutions receive comparatively little attention at the moment. There's some of those, they seem a bit wacky, like just stopping putting refrigerants into the sky. It doesn't seem to be something that most people are concerned about or have noticed. We need to widen our lens. We need to understand that there are a lot of things to do and get stuck into all of them. And accelerators are critical. For that, I'll point out a couple of things in a second. All individuals and institutions need to participate in this. It's not just in the hands of one body and certainly not one country. We need everybody to work together. And it is an immense commitment, but we need to make possibility a reality. Australia is no small player in this. We produce, we have only 1/300th of the world's population, just 25 million. But we create 1/80th of the carbon pollution of the sky. It's not proportionate with our population. And we dig up 1/20th, 4 times what our pollution is what we export. 3 times what we burn ourselves is exported. And to put that in perspective, we looked at a pyramid earlier in the presentation. Now consider a pyramid which is as tall as the tallest building and 1.3 kilometers across the base. That is a pile that if that was of coal, that would be how much coal Australia digs up and exports or burns each year. 500 million tons is a pyramid that tall. Puts it in perspective, doesn't it? We're no small player. But we're no small player with renewable energy too. And if anybody's read the Ross Garnaut book or looked at what the capabilities of Australia are with producing renewable energy and exporting it, I think you'll agree that we really need to consider we are best placed to source renewable energy in Southeast Asia. And just one quick word from our sponsor. I got involved with CCL because I realized several years ago when I retired 4 years ago that it wasn't the technology that we're lacking. It's the political willpower to do something about this that's lacking. And so I got involved with Citizens Climate Lobby because we need to provide an organisation, a way of working around the world to come up with solutions. It's a solutions-focused organisation, and working through respect, appreciation, and gratitude, we make relationships with politicians and anybody involved in the process with the intent that we are able to achieve a livable world by creating the political will for climate solutions. And so just to, as I say, ccl.org.au. I've gone well over time, I apologise. Over to you for questions.
All right, thanks, Tom. That was quite a sobering image of that large building pyramid of all the coal we export or use up. We need to do something about it. We have quite a lot of questions, so we'll try and get through as many as we can. The first one comes from James, and it says, your slide showing the thermostat knob showed 4 degrees warming at 400 parts per million CO2. However, IPCC figures suggest about 1.2 degrees warming. What's the reason for the discrepancy? Okay, well, 1.2 degrees of warming is what we've achieved thus far. The issue is that it's we're a slow oven. We've got the carbon emissions, the carbon in the sky and the sea have built up to well over 400 parts per million. If we maintain them at over 400 parts per million, then the temperature will continue rising. It hasn't stopped yet. What we've got to do is turn the thermostat back down again before the temperature rises beyond what it is now. If we just hold it where it is, it will continue rising to 4 degrees. That's what I'm saying. Okay. The next question, I guess, is more a comment than a question. And it's saying we can sequester carbon by building hempcrete homes. We can also do it by using timber in our buildings instead of concrete and brick. I don't know if you want to add anything to that. Well, yes, that is correct. If we use different materials which don't have carbon inherent in their manufacture, then certainly we can make buildings a lot more sustainable. Concrete for large cities, we do need concrete for certain structures. Roads, bridges are often far more effective, I guess. But we can produce concrete with far less embedded energy, embedded carbon involved in the process. Yes, there are lots of different materials we can be using. There is a lot of development with the CLT timber technology which are being used in tall buildings around the world, quite a few in Australia. I think that will be used much more. The question from John. Tom, why did you choose the 1.5 degrees scenario 2 option rather than the 2 degrees C scenario 1 option, given it looks like we've already spent the carbon budget for scenario 2? Well, it's a good question. I chose to go, it's funny, the first time I did the presentation, I chose scenario 1 to talk about because I thought that would be a sufficient amount. But look, to be honest, I feel we should aim high. And scenario 2, I believe, ought to be achievable. It's maybe not as achievable as scenario 1, but if you look at the Paris climate talks, what the IPCC and the Paris Agreement came up with is that we should be aiming for 1.5 degrees warming if we can achieve it. And that's what scenario 2 is aiming for. So that's why I chose to look at that particular one. But yeah, my mind is aim high. If we aim low, we're going to be unlikely to meet what we need. Okay, our next question comes from Kristen. It says, thanks, Tom. Love drawdown work. How is Paul Hawken promoting the strategies? Are there any leading institutions or governments adopting the strategies as a coordinated program? we haven't got time to wait?
I wish I could say they are. I'm not aware of any particular government organisation working on drawdown directly, but here's a little positive story. We presented a copy of Drawdown to Angus Taylor last year at one of our meetings with him, and he took close interest in it. And if you remember, just before Christmas, he and Morrison got up and were talking about their technology roadmap, which had 100 technologies by chance involved, which is exactly the number that's in Paul Hawken's book. So I'd like to think that maybe Angus is actually reading the book, if not necessarily applying all the principles. It will be interesting to see what his technology roadmap, which is due to be released later this year, will hold.
Okay. Question from Kathleen, which is a bit closer to home. In what ways do you think Renew could collaborate with Drawdown or other groups/movements to take advantage of the immediate opportunities COVID-19 lockdowns have created? Do you think that COVID-19 has shown that rapid and radical behaviour change is possible? Greenhouse gas emissions and pollution has dropped, as you mentioned. How could we best capitalise on this moment in history to collectively push for economic industrial system change?
Yes, that's a great question. I'm not sure I can answer it thoroughly, but yes, COVID has shown us the way. Looking across our lake, the one you can see behind me here, the air is just so much clearer these days. It just goes to show that when we just reduce our transport a little, well, it's reduced significantly this last couple of months, makes a big difference to the sky and to our health. So it's not just reducing carbon emissions. I would like to think that all of these seminars and talks that are going on at the moment, looking at trying to have a stimulus based on renewable solutions rather than more fossil fuels, may have some impact in the way we end up going. How do we get our governments to do more on this front? I think, well, it's an interesting picture from the federal point of view at this point. The states seem to be getting much more on board, and the local councils around Australia are declaring climate emergencies and getting stuck into what they can achieve. So it's good to see things are happening. And what I've seen overseas, I mean, in the UK, most people do recognise that climate change is real. There's very few people now who will debate the issue. We've still got the debate going on in Australia. We're a bit behind the times here. I'd like to think that we can move a lot quicker, and maybe that will come. Our economic background, we're very much reliant on coal as an export industry, and that's one of our failings. We've got to learn to wean ourselves off that.
Okay, the next question is from Bernadette. After watching Planet of the Humans, I worry about how much energy it takes to manufacture some of these solar solutions and how much land it needs. Also, I wonder what the lifespan of such technology is.
Yes, Planet of the Humans is an interesting movie in that it's very much old stories. The electric car that was shown was actually released 10 years ago. I own one of those now. It's still running beautifully, and we power it with 100% solar energy, so it's doing a good job. Now, electric cars and other things do take a bit of. We're producing a lot of carbon dioxide and putting it in the sky in making these things. It's true. They're not perfect. But look, wind farms are far more effective than demonstrated in that movie. Solar panels, they showed 8% efficiency on one set of solar panels. Like we've got 3 times that efficiency in new ones coming through these days. It was very much out of date statistics that were presented there. The cost of manufacturing these things is a significant part, but if we can get our manufacturing to be renewable as well as our energy sources, there's no reason to believe we can't produce these things and enjoy the lifestyles that we currently have without producing carbon. There's talk today, in today's paper, there's a whole pile of stories about green steel, how we can produce steel to make wind farms without using coal, without creating carbon emissions. It is possible. We can do it with hydrogen. We can create concrete, which is also a large part of making a wind turbine, because you have to have a very solid concrete base at the foot. And yeah, well, we can produce concrete without producing as many emissions as we currently do. So we need to change our industry as well as our power source. But yes, it's possible. And I don't know, that film is an interesting one to consider, whether Michael Moore was trying to break down the barriers by encouraging the naysayers to start believing in what he was saying. Maybe he's got the psychology in a different, he's got a different strategy on the psychology of these things than I have, but yeah, certainly an interesting movie that is not, well, I don't think it's helping the story. It's not very accurate.
The next question is from Eve, and it's a detailed question, and I think it's an interesting point we should know more about. I'm not sure if you know the answer, but she's asking about old refrigerants, about what can be done with old refrigerants and how can they be discarded to avoid releasing the greenhouse gases.
Well, yes. When you decommission an air conditioner or refrigerator, you have to make sure you collect the gases from within it. And there are mechanisms for doing this safely. The problem is that we're not doing it in every possible case. And you would think Australia would be doing as good as any country, but I know one council, and I won't name names, but a country council that has no mechanism for doing that. So any refrigerator or air conditioner that goes to the tip there, it has its refrigerant emptied to the sky, and it's just painful to see. We've got to change this. That's happening in Australia. What's happening in Asia? And they've got millions of air conditioners. I don't know whether you've seen the high-rise apartments in Hong Kong. Every window has an air conditioner in it. And they're all aging and getting thrown out. Yeah.
We've got a question from Westlaw, if I pronounce that correctly. It says, thanks for the opportunity for the community brainstorm. What a wonderful initiative. Could charcoal and biochar be retorted in solar ovens, be utilised for grow bed substrate on aquaponic vertical gardens in the sunny facing high-rise buildings that also accommodate climate-displaced professional farmers to tend the beds while the usual occupants continue telecommuting and working from home post-COVID-19? Now, there's a vision for you.
It does sound like a neat vision. I couldn't possibly comment on the overall thing. I guess I'm looking like I'm supposed to be an expert here, but I'm not an expert on these things. That sounds like a really neat plan. But what I will say is that it's interesting that our soils have lost an enormous amount of carbon in the way we till them, the way we treat them, the way we destroy forests on them. Those soils have added, I've heard different reports, but something in the order of 20% of the carbon that's gone in the sky over the last 60 or 80 years, has come from our treatment of the land, not from fossil fuels. It's quite a significant portion of the carbon that's gone up there. And we've got to drag that down and put it back in the soil. There are ways and means of doing that. I came across an interesting project last year called, always terrible at remembering names. No, forgot the name, sorry, but it's a group that were working on a fungus that they were inoculating the farmed soil with, that was growing a fungus and adding carbon to the soil at an enormous rate. And like there's a project going ahead as we speak to develop that so that it can be used around the world. They just want to make sure it's not going to have any detrimental effects on farmland, but it looks like a real winner. These projects are happening. We need to be able to support them and encourage them more, but drawing down enormous amounts of carbon in that way is where we need to aim.
We've gone well over the hour, Tom. Are you happy to keep answering questions?
Well, I am, if I can answer them. Yeah, it's up to you, Graham, whatever you want to do.
Well, maybe if we go for...
It's a shame I can't see the audience. I can't see if anybody's yawning or where we're going.
Well,
I must admit, I was stumbling through the talk a bit there, and I just don't have any feedback. And it's difficult because I like to be able to see who I'm talking to.
Well, there have been a few people logged off, but we still have quite a few people on board. So maybe if we just go for another 5-10 minutes or so.
I'm easy.
The next question is from Sabina. I'm an ecologist, so I can handle multivariants, but this COVID management period in our lives has taught me that, along with direct government packages, society needs a few simple messages to achieve major breakthrough: distance, cover, hand wash, etc. Any chance we could choose 3 major things for everyone to do consistently?
Is she referring to COVID or for climate change? Yeah.
I imagine for drawdown. What are the three lowest hanging fruit
things?
Yeah.
Well, there's one very low hanging fruit that is it ought to be an easy reach for our government, and that's to put a price on carbon.
Yes.
That would just help drive everything in the right direction. It's not something that we can do at a personal level, so it's probably not answering a question here, but it is one that if we did it in a way that didn't impact anybody, and a carbon fee and dividend would be the way to go for that. That is to take a fee on all carbon as it came out of the ground or came into the country that was destined to be burned. And then that would add to the price of fuels, it would add to the price of electricity, but all of the money raised would be given back to every individual on a per capita basis, so that they're not disadvantaged. They would have the money to spend to pay for the extra cost of those things. In fact, the analysis that's been done by our friends in the University of New South Wales say that 2/3 of the population would be better off or no worse off than they currently are financially, and the others would be able to afford to do things in a different way so they didn't need to spend money on carbon products, which is what we intend. So putting a price on carbon would be one clear one. In terms of what we can do at a personal level, solar panels on your roof are certainly a major plus. Moving to reduce your emissions in other ways. We've managed to go from 19 tonnes of carbon per year going into the sky, or carbon dioxide, 19 tonnes, to -2 tonnes by putting solar panels on our roof, having batteries and electric cars, and disconnecting the gas, having an air conditioner for cooling and heating, and going to solar hot water. All of these things are achievable.
And if you can't put solar on your roof, you can buy green power, which means more wind farms get built.
Exactly, right, yep.
The next one's from Tony. Tom, do you see any role for geoengineering in helping us to survive the climate emergency we face?
I fear we're going to end up resorting to it at the last minute, but I think geoengineering has some benefits if it's the likes of seeding the ocean with iron filings is an idea that some have had. That's so that we end up with algae growing on the surface and it then falling to the bottom, taking the carbon that's sequestered with it. That's not a bad idea. That's a form of geoengineering, I suppose. Sequestering carbon ourselves, if we were to grow algae and store it away in some other form rather than using it for fuel. But the types of things where we're throwing mirrors up into the into space above Earth are pretty fantastical ideas. How would that impact other things? Or putting sulfur dioxide in the sky to reflect the sky. What other side effects might that have? We don't really know. So, and it might just hide the problem we've got rather than solving it. I think we really should aim for nature's solution. But yes, it's not impossible that we'll end up there.
The next, well, I'll just take two more questions. They're quite straightforward. One is from Margot. What is the mechanism of composting that reduces carbon emissions?
How does composting reduce carbon emissions? Okay, well, composting, anaerobic composting, where you have no air, that's where you just dump everything in a pile. You get fermentation happening, and carbon dioxide is produced, but also methane is produced, and that is not a good thing to be adding to the sky. So where decay is happening in an anaerobic form, it's not good. So good composting involves putting air in with the compost, not letting it get too hot, and it holds the carbon better inside the compost, and it keeps the nutrients. One of the things we don't realize is whenever you crop from soil, you're taking the nutrients from the soil in the form of the plant away. So you need to put that back into the soil in order to keep the nutrients. Otherwise, you're throwing the nutrients away. One of the problems of our society is that we're not replacing those nutrients except through artificial fertilizers, and much better to keep those nutrients in. So that's where composting comes in, is keeping those nutrients in the soil and getting as much carbon back into it.
Okay, the last question is from Noni. Could you touch on the possibilities around hydrogen power, which didn't seem to get a Guernsey as one of the options?
Yes, it's interesting. I've not looked at it in huge depth. I've been very involved with electric cars, and it looks to me like hydrogen cars are not too much different from electric cars. They're effectively a way of storing energy other than in a battery, just putting it in as hydrogen. Mm-hmm. The big advantage of something like hydrogen is it's a gas that we can produce through simple electrolysis, and we can use electrolysis when we've got spare electricity from solar or wind power, and store it away, and it gives us a form of storage. So spare electricity, electrolysis converts water into hydrogen and oxygen. You can also store the oxygen and use that for other purposes. But storing the hydrogen, that's the energy source. We can then later burn that and get the energy back. It's not quite as efficient as using a battery, but it's a lot cheaper. And so it makes sense. And also you can store up that hydrogen, compress it, and send it overseas. So you're selling your energy overseas. There's a hope that we can migrate our current gas exports to Asia into being hydrogen exports to Asia, and therefore be feeding the Asian energy market through renewable energy produced here in Australia. It would be nice to be a net exporter of energy rather than an importer of all that fuel, for instance.
Okay, Tom. Well, I think we might bring it to a close. Thanks very much for your presentation. It's been very positive. We've managed to bring down the curve on COVID in Australia. So the challenge is, can we bring down the curve, the drawdown curve on emissions? And I guess if we all put our minds to it, yeah, I think we can. So I'd like to thank everyone for joining us, and I hope you found it all worthwhile. And as I think we mentioned earlier, there will be a video made which will be online on the Renew YouTube channel in the next few days. So thank you all, and we'll hopefully see you again next time.